Good morning, everybody. It's Friday, June 21st, 5:27 a.m. Central Time. Grain markets marginally higher this morning. Brian Split is here, guys. Let's start off with the weather.
Flood watches and warnings are in effect for parts of South Dakota, southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and Wisconsin today. A storm system pushed across the region early this morning. Meanwhile, a heat advisory is in effect for much of the eastern Corn Belt. Both the Euro and GFS models leave much of the eastern Corn Belt dry during the next 5 days. Both models now introduce eastern Corn Belt rain during the 5 to 10 day period. The extended GFS offers substantial rainfall for the region. To the contrary, the government released its official 30-day forecast yesterday. The forecast favors above normal temperatures and below normal rainfall for most of the U.S. Corn Belt.
Let's backtrack a little bit. So you've got flooding and excessive rainfall in some of these areas of southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, South Dakota. The market appears disinterested in this. It seems like this is just a rain makes grain type deal and that there is no concern regarding excessive moisture.
Yeah, I would say that when you see small pockets of flooding like this, and I know it's not small to the people that are getting it, but I believe the market generally sees that as okay. You've got a very small area that's going to get too much rain, but the areas around it, surrounding it, this is like you said, the rain makes grain attitude.
What about the heat thing? So the heat is expected to persist, and I know people will comment like it's summer, it's supposed to be hot. Yeah, but we're running well above normal in terms of temperatures, and it looks that way through like the first week of July. So the marketplace, the way that row crops and wheat also, but have just collapsed. I mean, it seems like the heat isn't an issue, excessive rain out west isn't an issue, and the only thing that really matters is that in this extended period, first week of July, there's rain coming for the Eastern Corn Belt, and all is well and good. I mean, that's the way it seems pretty simple, almost overly simple.
I think the heat was part of why we made the run up that we did in corn last week that made those peaks. Once the GFS had rain behind the heat, I think the market really sold off aggressively because of the GFS model.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of talk about how the GFS and the European model weren't matching up. So now that the European model's got some rain in that forecast for the Eastern Belt, that was what we had priced in here, and we didn't have trade on Wednesday. So yesterday was like 2 days worth of selling in one day.
What you'd like to see, ideally, if you're a market bull and not necessarily as a farmer necessarily, but you'd like to see this forecast shift over the weekend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And get one of those classic weekend shifts toward a drier pattern and get like a gap higher Sunday night. That's not a prediction, but this is the time of year where that sort of stuff happens.
Yeah, right. You want to see the weather models change. You want to see the comfort of this moisture in the forecast start to be taken away. Yeah. And also, I tend to think that as we progress into next week's crop conditions, Illinois, for example, went down 9% in corn and beans.
Should go down again.
So you're going to see, in my mind, especially with the heat that we've got, that the conditions should deteriorate further on the report next Monday.
If you guys are watching on YouTube and you have crop comments, drop them, because I know there are absolutely some concerns with regard to the wet start and planting in wet conditions. The market doesn't appear interested in that, but it's something that could matter down the road. Let's go to the Drought Monitor.
So portions of the western and northern Corn Belt received rainfall last week. However, the majority of these areas weren't experiencing drought, so the overall improvement in drought conditions across the region was limited. A lack of precipitation in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, central Michigan, southeast Iowa, and northeast Missouri caused conditions to worsen. Much of the High Plains received rainfall last week, leading to an improvement in conditions in southeast Nebraska and western Kansas. Meanwhile, conditions in western Nebraska, western Oklahoma, and central South Dakota deteriorated due to a lack of moisture. When we look at the percentage of U.S. areas experiencing drought, corn country 3%, soybeans 2%, winter wheat 17%, spring wheat 3%, and cattle country 10%.
I don't think this yellow on the map is going to scare anybody. You got to get into brown-red territory for people to get worried.
Yeah, the tough thing with the Drought Monitor is it is kind of a delayed reaction, right?
Yeah,
so,
sure.
But we did see, a large swath of the Eastern Corn Belt go from white to yellow, and then we saw the conditions in northwest Illinois and eastern Iowa go from yellow to a little bit more yellow, more coverage. So it seems like, yes, I agree. The yellow is not going to get anybody excited, but
No.
it isn't moving at the pace of what the actual conditions, the soil conditions are moving.
With 3% of corn areas experiencing drought, that's about as low as you'll ever see it. So there is no drought problem.
The U.S. has approved the import of Brazilian used cooking oil for the production of renewable fuels. The move comes at a time when soybean farmers and crushers are experiencing reduced profits due to an increase in imported biofuel production feedstocks. In 2023, imports of used cooking oil more than tripled compared to the previous year, and over half of those imports originated from China. Even before the approval of its used cooking oil, Brazil has been able to capitalize on the U.S. biofuel boom. During the first 4 months of this year, imports of Brazilian cattle tallow increased by 377% compared to the same period last year.
This appears, reading through this article, it appears to be news out of Brazil and not from the U.S. This is a quote from the article from Bloomberg. The U.S. has recognized international certification for Brazil's compliance with some sanitary and technical standards, according to a joint statement from the South American country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Agriculture. So the U.S. hasn't done anything to stop this used cooking oil import situation. It was about a month ago that the Biden administration put a bunch of tariffs on things from China, and most of this is coming from China, electric vehicles, solar cells, and other materials, but they left used cooking oil imports alone. I've told you guys, you got to get on the phone and call your trade groups, associations, call the police, call the damn Ghostbusters. I don't know who you call, but this is a bad deal for the U.S. farmer for sure.
It is. I think back to a year and a half ago when everyone was so excited about
Yep.
renewable diesel and, oh, we're going to need all of these soybean acres to be able to grow enough to have the beans that we need to crush to make the soybean oil for renewable diesel. But the problem is the science behind the renewable diesel allows for so many other alternatives besides soybean oil. And so now it's like, gosh, you can cook food, right? And so in China, they use vegetable oil, they fry all kinds of stuff in it, and there's a lot of them. And now all of a sudden we can use this used cooking oil. It just takes a lot of what we thought we would be using for renewable diesel, and we're using other things instead. And so it's a tough pill to swallow for sure.
I talked with Pete about this in one of the premium videos a week or two ago, and according to the international emissions standards or whatever it is, I think it was CARB, used cooking oil imported from China still has a lower carbon score than soybean oil produced in the United States, which is difficult for me to understand. But I think a lot of this is policy more so than science, and the science doesn't really matter. Policy is what matters, and the policy is unfortunate for you guys right now.
Demand for biofuels will likely support an increase in Brazilian soybean production. According to the Brazilian Crushers Association, in recent years, the Brazilian crop has expanded to meet Chinese demand, but now China is making an effort to lessen its reliance on imports. Brazil's soybean crop isn't expected to grow at the exponential rate we've seen in recent years. However, growth is still expected as the production of biofuels continues to increase. If Brazil were to receive favorable weather next season, the soybean crop could reach 170 million metric tons.
That's a big number. The guy that they interviewed or quoted here in the Reuters piece is the head of the Brazilian Soybean Crushers Association. He said this: I don't see the soybean area growing 1 million hectares annually in Brazil, as has happened in recent years, to meet Chinese demand. And 1 million hectares is about 2.5 million acres. That's what they're expanding on an annual basis. So he thinks it's going to be a biofuel thing and that maybe Chinese demand levels off. Does that make sense?
Right. So historically, we've seen not much evidence that the Chinese at this point are going to get much above 100 million tons of imports of soybeans per year. So they seem to have kind of hit a little bit of a ceiling on what their imports are. But the problem is, I don't really care what the reason is of why Brazil's going to be increasing their soybean plantings. The bottom line is they are, whatever's driving it, and that's going to continue to grow the size of their crop annually.
There's a big discrepancy in the Chinese import projections for new crop. I think USDA has it really high, 109.
Yeah.
And then I think it was the Chinese government came out and said it was it's going to be 96. There's a big discrepancy there. So if China is right, and I know, don't believe what China says, but if that number is closer to reality and Brazil's 170 next year, that's a significant problem for us, I think.
So, on the subject of China, Chinese imports of U.S. soybeans surged last month. Imports spiked by 156% compared to May of last year. At the same time, Chinese imports of Brazilian soybeans shrank for the first time this year due to historical flooding in the southern part of Brazil. Brazilian soybeans still made up the majority of Chinese imports last month, accounting for about 86% of imports. The U.S. only accounted for approximately 12%. During the first 5 months of this year, Chinese imports of Brazilian soybeans increased by 23% compared to the same period last year. Meanwhile, U.S. soybean imports declined by 34%.
This is by the time the beans are shipped, it's like old news. I think that the more important news when it comes to China is that they still, I've said that I'm a broken record, they haven't bought a single cargo of new crop U.S. soybeans.
Yeah, and you could say,
Hopefully we see it today, but
you could say, oh, it's up 156% year over year, but 156% of a small number is still a relatively small number. I think
this is not prime U.S. soybean
no,
shipping
this is
season.
not shipment season. I mean, that's typically fall into early winter, and the problem that we're seeing is the cycle. Every time Brazil grows a large crop, the cycle from when China goes from Brazil to U.S. Gets longer and longer, right? They stick around in Brazil even longer, and then they don't start buying U.S. beans until later in the marketing year.
Yep.
U.S. ethanol production increased last week. Weekly output of 1.06 million barrels was up 3.3% on the week and up 3.8% versus the same week last year. Ethanol stocks were pegged at 23.6 million barrels. The print was up 1.7% compared to the previous week and up 6.3% compared to the same week last year. Implied gasoline demand was up 3.8% compared to the previous week and up 2.1% versus the same week last year. On average, over the last 4 weeks, implied U.S. gasoline demand is down 1.6% versus the same period last year.
That's a good number. We're on track to hit the USDA target. Brian, have you heard much in terms of basis pushes, especially from ethanol plants? I've heard quite a bit around the country of these plants trying to get corn bought.
Yeah, I mean, the basis on old crop has been pretty strong. We've seen over the last couple of weeks, the July contract versus the September contract made a nice move where I think at the peak there was only like a penny and a half of carry between July and Sep. That all culminated, the spread making that high culminated with the most recent highs in July corn near 460, which we actually talked about a couple weeks ago on our technical video being an important level. But I think that shook some bushels loose that moved to 460. We saw the spreads back off. But ethanol has been a bright spot for corn, for corn demand. And, I think that was evident months ago that would probably likely be the case because of sugar values. So the high sugar values would suggest that the world would use U.S. Ethanol instead of the Brazilian ethanol made from sugar.
Yeah, I don't really have anything bad to say about corn demand. The new crop book of sales isn't very good, but that could change quickly. And just so happens that we had a record crop last year, and that's kind of what we're working through.
Record-breaking heat is expected to cause electrical bills to surge. Much of the U.S. is already experiencing above-average temperatures, and the heat is projected to stick around throughout the rest of the summer. For the rest of June and through August, it's estimated that the average U.S. monthly household power bill will rise to $173, a 3% increase over last summer. If not for the warm winter that we just came through, electricity would be even more expensive. A large amount of natural gas went unburned since there was less need for heat. Since then, however, natural gas producers have reduced supply to stabilize prices.
Natural gas has rallied back a little bit, but it's still very, very cheap historically. This has been one of the poorer performing commodities, say this year, I think, even with the rebound.
Yeah, and some of the things I've watched on natural gas are some of the spreads. So I was looking at October to December, for example, and a couple months ago, you would say that's carry in the market. The carry between October and December natural gas was about $1. And so I think if we do see the heat affect natural gas usage, there's too much carry in the natural gas market month to month, and that could potentially be a way to play the usage side of natural gas as these spreads narrowing back in a little bit, because that's an awful lot of price difference between 2 months of the same product.
Yeah. So the bottom of the barrel price on the board is like $1.50. It has been for a
Mhm.
long time. Does that continue to be the bottom of the barrel price? It looks like it.
Yeah, I think that continues to be a good area of value. And I had some clients say, well, should we be buying $1.50 natural gas? And that's where the spread came into play, because yeah, maybe you should be buying $1.50 natural gas, but you can't hold that contract very long. And then when you look at the next contract, it's not $1.50, it's $1.80. And then when you look at the next one, it's not $1.80, it's 2.10. So the problem with the natural gas market and trying to pick these bottoms at these $1.50 levels is only the front month contract is there.
Right.
And again, you can only hold it for several weeks, and then you got to move to the next contract. And that next contract is not that low of a price.
Yeah, it's tough to be long a market with carry, and anybody who's caught long corn futures, as an example, knows that all too well. What did cattle do yesterday?
They were lower ahead of today's cattle on feed report. Feeders were an average of 37 cents lower. Live cattle were an average of 38 cents lower, except for an average of 49 cents higher in the front two contracts. As I just mentioned, we have a cattle on feed report coming out here this afternoon. Cattle on feed as of June 1st is estimated to be 98.9% of year-ago levels. Placements during May are projected at 98.3% compared to last year, and marketings last month are estimated to be 100.3% of year-ago levels.
Outside markets here on Friday, U.S. dollars up a little bit, stocks are off, bonds are up a little bit, crude oil's off just a little bit. Brian's going to be taping our technical update here for the premium subs just in a few minutes, so that'll be out later today. Brian, thanks for joining us. Guys, have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next week.